Welcome back to the Schaeffer Dialogues. We're on Season 2, Episode 3, and today we're going to tackle Chapter 3 of Francis Schaeffer's Escape from Reason. Ready to dive in?
Absolutely.
Great, because Schaeffer doesn't pull any punches in this chapter. He starts by talking about how Christianity was actually essential for the birth of modern science. What do you make of that?
It might sound counterintuitive at first, but Schaeffer brings up folks like J. Robert Oppenheimer, the physicist who led the Manhattan Project, and Alfred North Whitehead, a prominent philosopher. Either were Christians, yet they both acknowledge this connection.
Okay, that's interesting. But why? Why do they believe Christianity is so important to the rise of science?
Schaeffer argues that Christianity provided the philosophical foundation that made scientific inquiry possible. You see, the idea of a rational God creating an ordered universe is actually a radical concept.
How so?
Well, before Christianity, many cultures viewed the universe as unpredictable, governed by the whims of gods or spirits. But the Christian worldview posits a universe governed by laws, by cause and effect, because it was created by a rational God.
I see. So it's not just about religious belief. It's about a way of thinking that makes scientific exploration possible. If you believe the universe is rational and ordered, then you can go out and actually try to understand it.
Exactly. And that's what we see with figures like Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler. They were working within this framework that assumed the universe was knowable because it was created by a God who values reason and order.
Wow, that's fascinating. So is Schaeffer saying that science couldn't have existed without Christianity?
He doesn't go quite that far, but he does argue that Christianity created a unique intellectual climate where science could flourish. He even points to later scientists like Faraday and Maxwell, who were deeply religious men, to support this idea.
Okay, so we've got this close relationship between Christianity and early modern science. But then Schaeffer talks about a shift that happens around the 18th century with thinkers like Rousseau and Kant. He calls it a transition from nature and grace to nature and freedom. What's going on there?
Well, Schaeffer argued that as the Enlightenment took hold, there was a move away from the idea of a divinely ordained order, the grace part, and an increasing emphasis on human freedom and autonomy.
So instead of looking to God for meaning and purpose, people start to look inward.
Yes, and this focus on nature and freedom, while seemingly positive, actually leads to some unintended consequences, according to Schaeffer.
Like what?
Well, as nature becomes increasingly autonomous, it starts to give rise to determinism.
Wait, how does that work? How does a focus on freedom lead to determinism? That seems contradictory.
That's the paradox Schaeffer is highlighting. As nature becomes the sole arbiter of reality, a closed system without any higher power, human freedom starts to feel very limited indeed. It's like we're just cogs in a giant machine.
So even though people are striving for freedom, they end up feeling trapped by this deterministic view of nature.
That's exactly the tension Schaeffer explores. It's this struggle that we see played out in the lives of figures like Rousseau and his followers.
You mentioned Rousseau specifically. What was his take on all this?
Schaeffer talks about how Rousseau and his contemporaries felt increasingly threatened by science. They saw it as reducing humans to mere machines.
It's interesting because on the one hand, science gave us this incredible power to understand and manipulate the natural world. But on the other hand, it also made us question our own place in the universe.
Exactly. And for Rousseau, this was a huge problem. He championed this radical, boundless freedom, this bohemian ideal, as Schaeffer calls it.
So he was trying to cling to this idea of human freedom in the face of a scientific worldview that seemed to be undermining it.
Yes, and this is where Schaeffer's concept of the lower story consuming the upper story comes into play. When we elevate the material world to an absolute, when we make nature completely autonomous, it inevitably starts to encroach on those other realms of human experience. Our beliefs, our values, even our sense of self.
Okay, so we've got Christianity laying the groundwork for early modern science. Then we have this shift towards an autonomous nature and the rise of determinism, which challenges the very idea of human freedom. And Rousseau is caught in the middle, desperately trying to hold on to this ideal of radical freedom.
You're getting it. And this sets the stage for a truly monumental shift in Western thought, which we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. And the figure who really embodies this shift, according to Schaeffer, is Hegel.
Hegel. Now, he's not exactly known for being easy to understand. What makes him so important in Schaeffer's story?
Schaeffer argues that Hegel basically changed the rules of the game when it came to how we think about truth.
Okay, I'm intrigued. But how?
Well, before Hegel, Western philosophy was largely based on these three key pillars: Rationalism, rationality, and the hope for a unified field of knowledge.
Rationalism,
The belief that we can understand the world through reason.
rationality,
The conviction that reason is valid, that truth exists.
and the hope for a unified field of knowledge.
This idea that we can find a single, overarching explanation for everything.
So the classical thinkers were all searching for the one right answer.
Exactly. Then they'd argue back and forth using antithesis. If A is true, then not A must be false. But Hegel comes along and says, look, we've been banging our heads against this wall for centuries, and it's getting us nowhere.
So what does he propose instead?
Hegel introduces this new method, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Instead of searching for absolute truth through antithesis, he says, let's take two opposing ideas, a thesis and its antithesis, and merge them into a new synthesis.
Okay, but doesn't that just create a new thesis that someone else will then argue against? It seems like an endless cycle.
That's the point. Hegel introduces this constant process of merging opposing ideas, which then become the starting point for further debate. Truth, in this view, is always evolving, always in flux.
So instead of searching for the truth, we're now in this constant dance of merging and reinterpreting ideas. That sounds pretty relativistic.
Exactly. And Schaeffer argues that this Hegelian relativism has had a profound impact on Western thought. He even uses it to explain the communication gap between generations.
What do you mean? How does Hegel explain why parents don't understand their kids?
Well, Schaeffer says the older generation, those raised in a pre-Hegelian world, still tend to believe in objective truth. They think there are right answers and wrong answers. But the younger generation raised on this diet of Hegelian synthesis is more comfortable with ambiguity and constant change.
I could see how that would lead to some misunderstanding. So Hegel's ideas have seeped into the very fabric of our culture. Did this Hegelian influence affect science as well?
Absolutely. Schaeffer distinguishes between early modern science and what he calls modern science.
Okay, I'm curious. What's the difference?
Well, both embrace the idea of a universe governed by natural laws, but early modern science, the science of Copernicus and Galileo and Newton, still saw room for God's action in the world. They believed in the uniformity of natural causes, but didn't necessarily view the universe as a closed system.
So there was still a sense that there was something more than just the material world.
Exactly. But with modern science, everything gets pulled into this closed system. There's no room for anything outside the material world. God, if he exists at all, is irrelevant.
It's like science built this amazing house and then decided to brick up all the windows and doors.
That's a great analogy, and Schaeffer argues that this shift has huge implications. It leads to a purely materialistic view of reality, where everything, even human beings, are reduced to mere matter in motion.
So how does all of this connect to that line of despair that Schaeffer keeps talking about?
It's all related. As different disciplines fall below the line, philosophy, art, music, even theology, they abandon the hope for a unified field of knowledge. The idea that there's a single, overarching truth that can explain everything.
So this line of despair isn't about sadness or depression. It's about the loss of hope for the unified answer to life's big questions.
Precisely. And Schaeffer places Kierkegaard as the embodiment of this modern man. He accepts that we live in a world of subjective truths and fragmented experiences. There's no longer any overarching narrative, no grand story that gives meaning to our lives.
I'm beginning to see how this all fits together. You've got this shift in thinking that began with Hegel. Then you've got modern science with its closed system, embracing a purely materialistic worldview. And then you have figures like Kierkegaard who embody this line of despair. It's a pretty bleak picture.
It is, and Schaeffer argues that this shift has had a ripple effect across Western culture, impacting everything from our art and music to our understanding of morality.
Schaeffer even connects this to the rise of figures like the Marquis de Sade. That seems like a big leap. How does a philosopher like Hegel end up influencing a libertine like de Sade?
It's all about the consequences of determinism. If humans are nothing more than machines, as modern science seems to suggest, then morality becomes meaningless.
Because if our actions are predetermined, then we can't really be held responsible for them.
Exactly. Schaeffer summarizes de Sade's philosophy with the chilling phrase, "What is right." We see echoes of this thinking in contemporary debates about things like genetic determinism and the implications of neuroscience for free will.
So this seemingly abstract philosophical shift that began with Hegel has had these far-reaching consequences impacting not just how we think about truth, but also how we think about ourselves and our place in the universe.
Exactly.
So we've talked about this shift from nature and grace to nature and freedom, the rise of Hegelian relativism, and the emergence of modern science with its closed system.
And let's not forget Kierkegaard standing there as the embodiment of the modern man below Schaeffer's line of despair.
Right. It's a lot to take in. But what's the takeaway here? What's the big picture point that Schaefer's trying to make?
Well, Schaefer is ultimately warning us about the dangers of making nature autonomous. He argues that when we elevate the material world to the status of an absolute, when we close off the possibility of anything beyond the material realm, we end up losing something essential.
Like what? What do we lose exactly?
Well, for starters, we lose sight of the transcendent, the idea that there's something more to reality than just matter and energy, something that gives our lives meaning and purpose.
So it's not just about science or philosophy, it's about how we understand our place in the universe.
Exactly. Schaefer is deeply concerned that this trend towards a purely materialistic worldview will ultimately undermine the very foundations of human dignity and freedom.
I see the connection to his earlier point about the lower story devouring the upper story. When the material world becomes the only reality we acknowledge, it starts to consume everything else, our beliefs, our values, our sense of self.
Precisely. And Schaefer argues that this is exactly what we see happening in Western culture. He points to the rise of nihilism, the dehumanization of art, the increase in violence and despair as evidence of this trend.
So it's not just an intellectual problem, it's a cultural and even a spiritual crisis.
That's how Schaefer sees it. He's making a case for the need to recover a sense of the transcendent, a worldview that acknowledges the reality of something beyond the material.
Okay, so Schaefer paints a pretty bleak picture of where we're headed. But does he offer any solutions? Is there any hope?
Schaefer doesn't offer easy answers, but he does point us in a direction. He reminds us that true human freedom can only be found in relationship to something greater than ourselves.
Something that transcends the limits of the material world.
Yes. And while Schaefer was writing from a Christian perspective, I think his challenge is relevant even for those who don't share his faith. He's calling for us to recognize the limitations of a purely materialistic worldview, to be open to the possibility of something more.
To see that science and reason are incredibly valuable tools, but they can't answer all of life's big questions.
Exactly. We need a more holistic approach, one that integrates scientific knowledge with a deeper understanding of the human spirit and our place in the cosmos.
So Schaefer's not anti-science, he's just arguing for a more balanced view of reality.
Right. He's not advocating for a retreat from the modern world. He's urging us to engage with it critically and thoughtfully, to see both its potential and its pitfalls.
Well, Schaefer certainly gives us a lot to think about. This whole idea of autonomous nature consuming everything in its path is a powerful image. Does this resonate with you at all? Do you see evidence of this trend in our own culture?
It's definitely something worth pondering. Are we, as a society, losing sight of what it means to be truly human? Are we sacrificing our freedom and dignity on the altar of progress and material prosperity?
These are big questions. And I don't think there are any easy answers, but Schaefer's work provides a framework for understanding the challenges we face. And hopefully it inspires us to seek a more meaningful and fulfilling way of being in the world.
Absolutely. And if you're interested in exploring these ideas further, I encourage you to check out Joseph R. Miller's work at morethincake.org. He's got some great resources for anyone who wants to delve deeper into Schaefer's thought and its implications for our lives today.
That's a great suggestion. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Francis Schaeffer. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope it sparks some new ideas for you.
I hope so too. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep the conversation going.